Hello everyone, welcome back to Ethics, Analytics, and the Duty of Care. I'm Stephen Downs. We're in Module 8 and this video is about culture. Now, I should probably say that I can't cover all of culture in one short video. I'm not even going to try. Probably a better title for this would be Topics about Culture with Respect to Ethics. But I like a nice, short, precise title. And, this is where our topic as a whole, ethics, analytics, and the duty of care, is going to intersect with culture. So that's what I'll name the video. All right, back to the camera view. So I'm going to begin with a few perspectives on what culture actually is. Now, this is just to frame our discussion and not to be authoritative about it. There are all kinds of ways we could define culture. So I've got a few here. One is the characteristics and knowledge of a particular group of people encompassing language, religion, cuisine, social habits, music, and arts. Another way of thinking of it is shared patterns of behavior and interactions, cognitive constructs and understanding that are learned by socialization. A third is a way of life of a group of people, the behaviors, beliefs, values, and symbols that they accept, generally without thinking about them. I've got a diagram here of the cultural iceberg, focusing on the top, the things that are pretty easy to recognize in a culture: language, dress, folklore, food, holidays, etc. But then the implicit parts of cultures that we don't talk about or don't see so easily: family roles, biases, interpretations, values, competitiveness, work ethic, thought patterns, personal space, etc., etc. Part of that, I don't have a slide for this, but part of the reason why I wanted to talk about culture especially is because, as we read through people like Thomas Kuhn and Emir Lakatos, we have this sense that any academic discipline, any science, is in itself a culture. And we don't usually think of culture in that sense, do we? Usually we think of cultures as, nations or peoples or faiths or language groups or whatever. But there is a culture of philosophers. There is a culture of data scientists. There is a culture of biologists, and actually even subcultures in all of those cultures. And I want to keep it in mind because as I'm talking about culture, I'm not just talking about our social groups that we meet in our towns and in our villages. I'm talking about the social groups as well that we meet in our professional life or our academic life or our scientific life. And these are the cultures that are probably going to be more relevant when it comes to ethical considerations with respect to AI and analytics. So moving on, with respect to cultures, we can draw distinctions between various aspects of these cultures. So here we have, basically from OECD, a distinction between three aspects of cultures. First of all, the material, social, and subjective aspects of cultures. That is, the artifacts that we see, touch, feel, taste, whatever. The second aspect are what they call the social institutions of the group. Now, I think institutions is probably the wrong word, but it might include, for example, language, communicative conventions, folklore, religion, etc. Some of them may be institutions, some of them might not be. A belief system, like a religion, can be institutionalized, but is not necessarily institutionalized. And that's also the case with things like language. Then third, the things I guess that are definitely not institutionalized, the beliefs, values, discourses, and practices that group members commonly use as a frame of reference for thinking about and relating to the world. So we might style that as Weltanschauung or worldview, right? Or we might, in the manner of George Lakoff, think of that as a frame. But it's a perspective or a context, a way of seeing the world. In the case of science and academic disciplines, it's what sort of things we think of as problems, what sort of things are acceptable as solutions, what counts as evidence, what's important, what's not important, all of that sort of thing. So, culture gets used a lot, especially in the field of digital media, online learning, schools generally, academic analytics. So you have, well, I've titled this slide, Culture of This, Culture of That. We hear about, for example, a culture of innovation. And this is from a JISC article, happily entitled Moving Past the Tyranny of Innovation. But, you know, I mean, things like not working in silos, not being or being driven by data, things like that count as an innovative culture. I'm going to be hand wavy because it doesn't matter to me what an innovative culture is. Similarly, Pierre Levy in Ethics of Collective Intelligence talks about a culture of hospitality. And there are all kinds of cultures that we could talk about. And so these are, the way to think of these, I think, are adjectival, right? So we're not defining a culture that is the culture of innovative people, right? What we're doing is we're taking some culture, say a culture of people working at some company, or a culture of a people in a country, and saying, what would it be for us to describe that culture as innovative? And so an innovative culture would be more focused on collaboration and cooperation. An innovative culture would be more likely to look at the data and evidence. So we think, right? So, and that makes sense, that way of talking about culture. So you can define a culture by what it is. You can talk about properties of culture. So what I'm doing here is I'm kind of acknowledging that we can have collective nouns that we call cultures, that cultures can have properties, like being innovative or whatever, and it's going to follow to some degree that cultures can have the sorts of properties that we would associate with ethics. But just like no person is inherently ethical or unethical, we'll come back to that, so also no culture is inherently ethical or unethical. So the question of culture and ethics is something like, what would it be to call something an ethical culture or a culture of ethics? Okay. Well, to UNESCO, it might be a culture of global citizenship. And it draws out three dimensions of this. First of all, to acquire knowledge, understanding, and critical thinking, etc., etc. Second, a socio-emotional component, which is to have a sense of belonging to a common humanity, sharing values and responsibilities, empathy, solidarity, and respect for differences and diversity. And then third, to act effectively and responsibly at local, national, and global levels for a more peaceful and sustainable world. And we might think, and I am among those who think, I would say, that this is, a pretty good ethical kind of a culture. But, I also recognize in my own humility that other people might think differently. It's one thing, I think, to say this is an ethical culture, and another thing to say we have defined what it is to be an ethical culture. And I think we're going to run into all of the same problems that we had when we were talking about ethics generally way back in the previous units, in the previous modules. For example, values and responsibilities, empathy, solidarity, etc. These are sort of like parts of virtue ethics, sort of like parts of a deontological point of view. We go back to Max Weber, and he's looking at this, or followers of his are looking at this, and where's the prosperity here? We see peaceful and sustainable world. That's wonderful. Where's the prosperity? Where's the wealth? Where's the growth? And that's a very different perspective on this, a consequentialist perspective. So we can say that this is a definition of an ethical culture, but not the only one. Here's a different perspective. This is from OECD, and we would expect a different perspective. They define it in terms of what they call global competence. So they're not even going to say that it's ethical, but I think we can take it as that because competence is good, right? So what do they say? Global competence is the capacity to examine local, global, and intercultural issues to understand and appreciate the perspectives and worldviews of others, to engage in open, appropriate, and effective interactions with people from different cultures, and to act for collective well-being and sustainable development. So here's our profit growth, collective well-being and sustainable development. There's an aspect here of virtue. There's an aspect here, obviously, of competence, which, might be traceable to virtue. It doesn't say that we're required to do these things. It just says that we can do these things. So again, this is a account of what might be called an ethical culture, or at least an ethical competence. Was probably not definitive. UNESCO is very specific in defining what it thinks a global common good is through its Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, and this is very much a consequentialist approach. Number one is no poverty, 2, no hunger, good health, quality education, gender equality, clean water, clean energy, good jobs and economic growth, innovation and infrastructure, reduced, not eliminated, but reduced inequalities, sustainable cities and communities, responsible consumption, protect the planet, life below water, which is kind of an oddball, life on land, and peace and justice. 14 and 15, life below water and life on land, don't really have the same status as objectives the way no hunger or good health do, except in the obvious sense that there should be life underwater. Still, these can be thought of as guiding us toward an ethical culture as well. What's interesting in all of these is there is this sense that, first of all, culture can be ethical, and that there's this definition of globalness, right? It does get away from the dual ethics theory that was talked about in the first video, and toward this idea that there's one single integrated global society. And sometimes that becomes very specific when we talk about, for example, with the UNESCO culture of global citizenship, sense of belonging to a common humanity, sharing values and responsibilities. Somebody looking at that might say, what really seems like an assimilationist point of view, where we all have to share the same values and share the same responsibilities. And that points to, I think, a pretty fundamental distinction that we need to draw between three things. The first thing is teaching people about what some particular culture is or should be, by teaching them about existing and valued artifacts, behaviors, and attitudes. And that's what we've seen in these three preceding accounts of an ethical culture, right? The attempt to teach people what it is to be an ethical culture, what properties a culture would have to have in order to be considered ethical, where ethical is an adjective. The second thing, and this is mentioned in the OECD definition, but not so much in the UNESCO definitions, teaching people how to value and respect the difference between cultures. And that's different. That's not the same as teaching about your own particular culture or some particular ideal culture. It's a recognition and endorsement of the idea that there might be multiple cultures and that they might have a relatively equal stance from the perspective of value, good, ethics, etc. And we have a train going by. And then third, and where I really think, as they say, the rubber meets the road, teaching people how to contribute to a culture through the creation and fostering of artifacts, behaviors, and attitudes. And there's no need for that other rant there. I don't know why it's there. Like I said, it's the 24th of December, and I'm lurching toward the finish line here. But you see the difference, right? And this is a really common thing that I've seen in a lot of the discussion, not just of culture, but of ethics generally. The difference between people trying to tell you what ethical is, what kind of an AI would be an ethical AI, as opposed to what you need to do in order to build an ethical AI. It's kind of a bad analogy there, but you get the idea. Or what you need to do in order to come to an understanding of what it is to be an ethical AI. How to define your own ethics, if you will. And there really is a big difference between these two. This gets complicated when we realize that culture and learning are integrated, and that just as a culture can be ethical, where it's an adjective, a culture can be a learning culture, where the learning part is an adjective. In other words, being a learning culture is a kind of way of being a culture. There's probably many more adjectives that can describe cultures, but we'll deal just with two for now. And this is tricky because culture is something that we're creating, and yet culture is something that seems to have these properties independently of what we create. So let's think about how we create a culture. So from Catherine Lombardozzi, we get culture is a socially constructed phenomenon. Okay. It exists in a relational space, that is, how we interact with each other, and is formed in the values we espouse, the beliefs we carry, the actions we take, and in the stories we tell, and in all of those other things that we talked about in the first few slides of this presentation. The main thing here is that it's something we create. Now, I want to put in a bit of a bracketed aside here, because I think this is relevant for the future. And this aside is the distinction between something that we construct intentionally and something that we grow. And I've talked a lot about this distinction in other contexts, especially with respect to learning and development generally, because there's a certain school of thought that depicts learning as a form of construction, that we are, quote, making meaning when we're learning. So it's an intentional act. We're deliberately building models or pictures or concepts or ideas or values or structures or objectives or goals, anything that can have meaning, right? The semantical thing. But I don't see it that way. I see it as something that grows independently of our intentions. People are learning all the time, whether they plan to or not. It's something that can be affected by what we do, but learning isn't to make something, it is to become something, to develop oneself, to grow like a muscle. Nobody would ever talk of, well, I'm going to construct a muscle. I mean, maybe sometimes you might use that as an expression if you're a bodybuilder and you're talking about shaping your muscle or something like that. But even then, you're not going to do muscle installation or anything like that, right? You're growing a muscle. And similarly, you're growing in learning. And I think, with room for me to be wrong here, that culture is something that is grown as well. It is formed in the values and the beliefs, etc., etc., but it's not like we take those and deliberately build this artifice. Now, sometimes we build cultural institutions that may actually formalize these things, and we can be dragged up the stairs that I've been talking about. But I think most of what we think of as culture is stuff that happens further down. It's more in the informal, the practices side of thing. And that comes out with the two ways of thinking about culture that Lombardozzi talks about. The traditional Edgar Schein-like definition that speaks of culture as a pattern of shared basic assumptions versus the culture that is found in a petri dish, where culture is understood as the growth produced in that environment. And a pattern, interestingly, I think it's the sort of thing that we grow. There's an open culture today. There's a video about murmurations. But the murmurations in this case aren't actual murmurations of self-organizing starlings. They're murmuration-like patterns that were actually pre-planned and very carefully choreographed. Now, some kinds of patterns can be like that, but mostly patterns that we see in the world are patterns that grow, not patterns that are created. So I think both of those are actually talking about the same sort of thing. But also, the difference is between the shared basic assumptions versus the growth. And culture could be talked about as something, some way in which we are all the same. But the petri dish thing, I think, is more along the lines of thinking of culture as something that grows and develops and is connected, as Dave Cormier would say, is rhizomatic. So let's think about this. Doug Thomas and John Seeley Brown talking about a new culture of learning talk about informal, unplanned, interaction-oriented activities. And they say, for example, when play happens within a medium for learning, much like a culture in a petri dish, it creates the context in which information, ideas, and passions grow. And so they say the new culture of learning actually comprises two elements. The first is a massive information network that provides almost unlimited access and resources to learn about anything. The second is a bounded and structured environment that allows for unlimited agency to build and experiment with things within those boundaries. And my thought about this is, it sounds an awful lot like they're talking about the petri dish and not the culture. And that's, I think, the difference between the formalism and the non-formalism. The formalism is talking about the environment, the structure, the organization, how to build things like petri dishes. But the messy bits aren't that. The messy bits are something else. They're a thing that grows. So what are they? What is it? Well, I did a presentation a number of years ago where I tried to capture this. I talked about the design of the MOOC and the interaction and all of that. So what are the cultures of learning? They are what we do, what we model, what we share, what we create. I could say, culture is us, but it isn't quite that. Culture is us and all of our artifacts thought of as a whole, as a messy petri dish of stuff. And we focus, when we focus on the different properties of a culture, on the petri dish, right? So when we're talking about an ethical culture or a learning culture, we tend to talk about the structure in which that culture is going to grow and pretend almost that that's the culture. But that isn't the culture. That's the structure in which the culture grows. And there can be good structures for growth and bad structures for growth, but it's distinct from the culture. The culture is what grows. And that is what we do in those environments and with those environments. When we talk about AI and analytics, we need to also make this leap from culture, broadly, generally conceived, to the culture of organizations that make these things or use these things. Because very rarely are we ever involved in a discussion about individuals using AIs. Now that's going to become more and more important over time, and I'll talk about that in a bit. But mostly right now we're talking about organizational cultures. So here we have some more cultural properties, right? Flexibility, independence, interdependence, and stability. And these are, to me, again, elements of the petri dish. But we kind of try to make them elements of the culture. So we say, well, no, it's a flexible culture. It's an independent culture. The people need to be flexible. The people need to be independent, etc. And I'm not really clear about that. It's this petri dish kind of thinking that gives us a statement like this. An organization's culture is based on values derived from basic assumptions about the following: human nature, the organization's relationship to its environment, appropriate emotions, and effectiveness. So, presumably, the argument here is, if you constructed an environment where these four things were addressed, that would tell you what the values are. And I don't agree. I don't agree. That shows you what the thinking of the Petri dish designer is. But artifacts have a habit of being used in ways other than they've been designed. Yes, you can try to create an architecture of control, which almost is what an organizational culture is. But it doesn't follow that having achieved that control, you have also achieved an ethical outcome. It's just a mechanism for control. The question of what the ethics are is left undefined. Appropriate emotions, for example. What emotions should people be encouraged to express and which ones should be suppressed? Does not sound like a framework for creating ethics at all. It may well be that people choose to express some emotions and not express other emotions, but there's a difference between them choosing to express these and a culture or a structure, or as I've been saying, a petri dish that encourages or suppresses these sorts of expressions. OECD says organizational culture drives ethics. I say ethics drive organizational culture. And that's a really big difference. Trevino and Nelson write, culture is a complex and multi-system framework that must be aligned in order to encourage ethical behavior. I say ethical behavior is what must align the complex and multi-system framework. Still, the culture, I think we could say, reflects the ethics, right? It doesn't create the ethics, it reflects the ethics. So that's why we can point to things as indicators of the ethical or unethical aspects of an organizational culture. What things? Well, we have them listed here. Formal elements, including the official communications of executives, the internal policies and codes of conduct, training programs, employee selection systems, as well as systems for managing performance and goal setting. These are very revealing about the ethics of a corporation, but they don't exist independently of the people in the corporation who are creating them. Similarly, informal elements include norms of daily behavior, rituals that help members understand the organization's identity and its values, the myths and stories people tell about the organization, and the language people use in daily behavior. These reflect the ethics of the organization, but the organizational culture does not define them. Now, to be sure, we could probably point to an interplay happening here because people are influenced by culture. We can all think of some of these companies that are based on what has come to be called a bro culture, and the ethics of the people who founded the company led to that organizational culture being a bro culture, and then the bro culture feeding back into the behavior of the people in the company, how they talked to each other, how they communicate with each other, how they work with respect to customers, etc. But the culture isn't what drives the ethics. The ethics is what drives the culture. And I think that's a really important point. This is a thing from Ethical Systems, talking about different ways cultures, organizational cultures, can be ethical or unethical. The negative elements, which would be ethically bad, I guess, are unfairness, abusive manager behavior, selfish orientation, lack of awareness, fear of retaliation. Whereas on the positive side, you have organizational trust, ethical leadership, benevolent orientation, empathy, efficacy, and speaking out. The argument here is you end up with a better organization with these positive elements. It takes us all the way back to Max Weber, doesn't it? Being ethical is good for business. But you don't get that without the people in the organization being trustworthy, being ethical, being benevolent, being empathetic, and being efficacious. And I don't want to build this picture of culture that is reductionist to its individuals. A culture can be a thing. It can be a thing in itself that has properties and therefore could be thought of as a thing that acts, a thing that has causal efficacy. But it's not the sort of thing that has these properties in and of itself. The properties, the qualities of a culture or any organization are inseparable from the acts taken by the people who are a member of that culture. You can't have one without the other. And we see this to a degree when we talk about, in the world of AI and analytics, things like a culture of data governance. So here, this is just an example from a blog post titled "Building a Data Culture." A strong, quote unquote, maybe they mean ethical, data culture typically encompasses the following components: access to quality and trustworthy data, high levels of data literacy, cross-functional collaboration, clearly defined roles and responsibilities, adoption of technology, and data citizens who feel empowered to make critical decisions based on data. That culture is instantiated in the individuals, or more accurately, again, the acts of the individuals who are a part of that culture. Quality and trustworthy data, as we have seen, isn't a thing in itself. You don't go out there and you pick from the stock of quality and trustworthy data. It has to be made. It has to be collected, preferably ethically. It has to be clean, sorted, organized, labeled, etc. Same with data literacy, which is a property of the people. An organization, it's hard to characterize an organization as being data literate or not without talking about its people, etc. So that mostly is what I want to say about culture. It might not seem like a very strong point. It feels a little weak to me now, even as I'm saying it, so I'm being honest here. Um, but, there's a lot of writing in our field, and especially with respect to ethics and analytics, about organizations, organizational culture, organizational values, almost as though they're separate and independent from the people who create them. We need to be careful about this. Back a ways, I forget exactly where it was, but we were talking about the idea of autonomous AI engines and the question of responsibility. And one of the things we talked about is whether we could separate the responsibility that an AI has for its own autonomous actions from the people who own the AI or created the AI or who run the AI. In other words, hold the AI alone accountable and dismiss the accountability of the rest of the people involved. And our first reaction is to say, well, we would never do that. That would be crazy. That would be absurd. But we come into talking about cultures, and especially organizational cultures, although the discussion is not limited to that. And we have exactly that kind of talk. Where, again, OECD, culture drives ethics, right? And so we have this thing that is set up as its own independent entity, a corporate person, if you will, that is responsible for the ethical or unethical actions of the members of the culture. And this view isn't limited to our treatment of organizations. A lot of the conflicts that we have in the world are based on it, where the unethical actions of a member of one culture, one country, say, or one religion, are felt to reflect on the entire culture. And we blame the entire culture for the actions of that one individual. And we say silly things like, this person's religion made them unethical, which is the sort of thing that we saw when I introduced this section about the single mode and dual mode ethical systems, right? It was exactly that sort of effort. We know that, intellectually at least, that this is wrong. I mean, collective punishment is a war crime. We know that. Because you're punishing individuals as though they were, or you're punishing a culture as though it were the actor of some kind of activity. But responsibility and therefore punishment belongs not to organizations, it belongs to individuals. That's why there are laws, for example, in this country that allow that if a company is found to have broken the law, the company can continue on if the people in the company, usually the executives and the directors of the company, are separated from the company and held to account themselves in some way. We've actually seen instances of that. It was the cause of a great controversy earlier on in the Trudeau administration. So we have that sense, but we have this tendency to blame collections of things for the actions of individuals. And this goes back to the theory of change that Julian Stodd talked about, where we depict these as these great conflicts between systems. But they're not points of interaction between systems, they're points of interactions between people who have different backgrounds and different cultures. And I think that's how we need to regard these things. And that's how we can reconcile a theory of change and a theory of individual action. If change only occurs from the collision of great systems, then the role of the individual in such a case is to be the sand that is ground down to dust in between them. All right, maybe I'll want to come back and redo this section, maybe not, but I'm not really going to change the overall conclusions here. I think I might want to express them better, but that's basically what I want to say. You'll see more of this when I do the sections on citizenship and democracy. We'll get to this a little bit more pointedly. So I'll stop this video for now. I'll be back with the next video in just a couple moments. My time, your time, whenever you get back to my next video. I'm Stephen Downs. This is Ethics Analytics